Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Art of Unconscious Bias, or why the notion of unconscious bias is itself biased. The heart has its reasons, which reason does not at all perceive. Blaise Pascal. If I could tell you what it meant, there would be no point in dancing it. Isadora Duncan. Ta-da! And there's Isadora putting herself out there in an interpretive dance. So hi everybody, and what I wanted to talk about today, as the title obviously suggests, is the notion of unconscious bias. And I'm not going to dwell an awful lot on the precise concept and how human resource departments, for example, around the Western world have imposed it on workers. And when you do the online, I'm sure most of you will have experienced it, you do the online test, and if you don't say yes right from the get-go, that you totally admit mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, I am biased, then you failed. Talk about presuppose your own conclusions. So it's a preordained answer that they're after. But rather, in loads of online discussions, and when everyone gets to discuss from both sides the concept of things like woke, there's a lot of heat and anger. But I always get frustrated because the conversation or the argument tends to go around in circles. People have their, determined positions, and very rarely do you ever get to actually get behind the concepts themselves. So what I want to do today is actually analyse the notion of unconscious bias from a different perspective. The perspective of the unconscious as an important element of human cognition. So rather than the presupposition in human resources that unconscious bias is automatically and inevitably a bad thing, I'd suggest that betrays a very weak and poor understanding of what the unconscious actually is. So building upon previous videos, I'm going to draw mostly upon the work of Gregory Bateson from his book. There's a specific essay in his book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And that's what I'll focus on and start to introduce other theorists that in future weeks I want to develop. And just to explore, like I say, this notion of the unconscious that we tend to see as a poor cousin almost, or a poor relation to our conscious mind. And whether you are convinced or not, I just want to present to you an alternative point of view that actually argues the unconscious is much more important than we tend to give it credit for, and not in a Freudian sense. So going beyond the idea that the unconscious is where everything is repressed. It's like, I think Freud referred to it as the cellar of our minds, where everything gets pushed down. Like most emotionally repressed British people, we don't do feelings. We're taught from a very young age to pack everything into a nice neat ball and push it deep down. And I partly agree with that. I think we're all emotionally incontinent these days. But anyway, digressing. This idea of bias for conscious purpose. Conscious purpose is a phrase that Bateson uses. And it's just another way of talking about the notion of rationality or being reasonable, or the notion of reason. And Bateson makes some great points. So when he talks about an ecological perspective, so if you think just as it's almost like a metaphor, which I'll get into in a second, but the notion of ecology, an interwoven environment where cause and effect are very complex, and organisms, coexist and all interact and affect each other. He makes the point that when human beings try and exert conscious purpose into a complex ecosystem, they often just create havoc. So I think there's various examples he gives, but off my own back of my own thoughts, the notion of in Australia, I'm pretty sure they introduced cane toads at one stage. Forgive me if I've got this wrong, but from your own experience or reading, I'm sure you'll come up with your own examples of when human beings have tried to do something in a natural setting and have just made things 10 times worse. So I think they introduced cane toads to try and bring down the fly population. And what they found was it was just a massively invasive species. And now you have in parts of Australia massive cane toad inundations that they can't totally get rid of. And I think Bateson himself gives the example of things like pesticides. If you too successfully kill off the insects, then you often also kill off some of their predators, and that has iterative effects on the local ecology. So this idea that conscious purpose, human beings, especially when we overemphasize our scientific mindset, we tend to over privilege our conscious purpose, our rational side of our brain, and not actually appreciate the extent to which our unconscious side of our brain actually has aspects that are very important for human cognition, which is what I'm going to explore today. So I'm going to suggest we're biased. If we're going to talk about unconscious bias, I'm going to suggest we're actually biased towards conscious thought. And I'll explain that, like I say, as we go along. So this is the essay within SEM, stands for Steps to an Ecology of Mind, which is the collection of Bateson essays, which is re-released in 2000, I think, but I think it's available in paperback, and in the description I'll do a link to a PDF online that you can read, or you can search through the whole book just to check, if you want to check any quotes I'm using, to see what context I took them from. So he wrote this great essay, Style, Grace and Information and Primitive Art. And like with all of his essays, the title doesn't really, it tells you something, but his essays are just really, really rich, and they often depart from the nominal title. So that's the first essay I'm going to be mostly drawing upon, but I want to start to introduce you to these ideas also. So loosely, I'd suggest most of these ideas could be brought under the umbrella term cognitive linguistics, which I'll elaborate on in a second. And the notion of metaphor and embodied mind research, conceptual blending theory, left brain, right brain, which is the last of those, left brain, right brain, is Ian McGilchrist type stuff that I've spoken about in previous videos. And going up from the bottom, conceptual blending theory, I will give you examples of later, specific explanation, but it's mostly about the way in which, at an unconscious level, the human brain makes use of various perceptual processes. So it's at an unconscious level. We're not fully conscious we're doing it, but it's essential to human thought. So the unconscious, according to conceptual blending theory, is much more complicated and important than we tend to give it credit for. Linked to that are notions of metaphor and embodied mind research. That argues that the human mind is, you can't separate it out. So Western philosophy has always had a bias to the idea that from Descartes especially onwards, I think therefore I am. It separates out. It's called mind-body dualism. There's the mind and the body as separate entities, and the mind is in control of the body. Embodied mind research suggests that the human brain, because it becomes in a body, has a particular way of thinking, and that you separate out the mind and the body at your peril, because it doesn't fully give credit to the uniquely embodied forms of human thought. So, and then all of these, I'd suggest, to some extent come under this umbrella concept, like I said, of cognitive linguistics. And one of the unifying themes in cognitive linguistics is the notion of metaphor and how powerful it is. Not, and I emphasize this, and I'll keep giving you examples as we go through, metaphor as it's understood in cognitive linguistics is not just poetry or poetic language. According to cognitive linguistics, conceptual metaphor is a mode of thought. And what it means by that is the way in which we think of the world, at its very root, involves to some extent metaphorical method of thinking. So one very quick example would be when you think of, say, life as a journey, there are loads and loads of expressions in many languages, but if we just keep to English, if you think of emotions expressed as you're filled with rage, often emotions are expressed in relation to the notion of a container or levels of something rising. So one basic point of cognitive linguistics is there are, at the very root of our thought, there are things like spatial metaphors. There are metaphors about containers being filled to various levels. As I mentioned, there's the idea that life is a journey. And it's very difficult to talk without actually using quite subtle forms of metaphor that mostly we don't recognize as metaphor. We think it's just common sense ways of speaking. And that may not sound so what, you might ask, but if metaphor is at the crux of how we think and we're not fully conscious of it all the time, this relates to the power of the unconscious. And what I want to develop in this talk is that art, as always, visual art and literary art, they at their best engage with metaphor. They engage with our unconscious. So if you buy the argument from cognitive linguistics that the human mind at its very core uses metaphor, and a lot of our thinking occurs at an unconscious level, then art is an incredibly powerful route towards our own unconscious. So we'll see how artists like Van Gogh is one of my favorites. He manages to dig out from his unconscious portrayals of angst and portrayals of anxiety and portrayals of the intensity of nature that most people aren't. That's his gift as an artist. He can dig deep into his unconscious. And one of the overarching themes of this whole channel is that once you lose familiarity with art, visual and literary, if you're not careful, you lose some contact with your own unconscious. And as a society, one of the arguments is because we're biased towards this notion of conscious purpose, because human resource departments, as just one small example, are trying to drive out aspects of our unconscious to say it's bad if you think in a certain way, if it's your natural reaction to something. I'm not saying your natural reaction shouldn't be questioned, and you shouldn't be biased against people in a negative, racist way. But to automatically assume that every instinctive response or every unconscious response is automatically bad is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or it's cracking a nut with a sledgehammer, to keep using metaphors, as I'll explain as we go along. Like I say, metaphors are crucial. So anyway, just to give more examples, these are some of the authors in future weeks I'll be drawing upon. So it's a potentially huge area. I've already referred to Ian McGilchrist, but there's a whole mini literature in cognitive linguistics that I've been reading about, and I just thought it'd be interesting to dig into some of their ideas. Now, this is from all the quotes from now on, unless I specify otherwise, are from the essay by Bateson that I just started off citing. So Bateson here says, Aldous Huxley used to say that the central problem for humanity is the quest for grace. He explained the word, however, in his own terms. He argued, like Walt Whitman, that the communication and behaviour of animals has a naivety, a simplicity, which man has lost. Man's behaviour is corrupted by deceit, even self-deceit, by purpose, and by self-consciousness. As Aldous saw the matter, man has lost the grace which animals still have. And I just find it very interesting, this concept of grace, because it sounds quite religious, it sounds quite airy-fairy, but Bateson via Aldous Huxley is pointing out, if you have animals of your own, I always refer to my two dogs, but there is something very self-contained It's both a limitation and the beauty of being an animal. You're not particularly self-conscious. You live, in these terms being used here, gracefully within your own existence. The advantage and disadvantage of being a human, so the cause of all our anxiety and our great achievements equally, is our self-consciousness. But I think one of the greatest challenges being a human is being in touch with your unconscious side. And again, to repeat what I said earlier on, arguably that's what art and great artists enable us to do. They bring some grace into our lives in the sense that they help us be more at peace with our unconscious, and they stop us being so anxiety-ridden and self-conscious. But anyway, just to follow on from, develop this quote further, I argue that art, again this is Bateson, all of these quotes will be Bateson's, I argue that art is a part of man's quest for grace, sometimes his ecstasy in partial success, sometimes his rage and agony at failure. I shall argue that the problem of grace is fundamentally a problem of integration, and that what is to be integrated is the diverse parts of the mind, especially those multiple levels of which one extreme is called consciousness and the other the unconscious. For the attainment of grace, the reasons of the heart must be integrated with the reasons of the reason. So this goes back to the bit I've italicized at the bottom by Bateson. That goes back to the Blaise Pascal quote I started with, the epigraph at the beginning, the idea that the heart has its own reasons. And this fundamentally a problem of integration. For those of you familiar with the channel, you'll have heard of me several times. I very much enjoy the work of Ian McGilchrist and his work on left brain, right brain. And his whole work is about our need to integrate both sides of our brain, to use both sides, not to privilege one over the other disproportionately. And I think this is what Bateson's saying before McGilchrist was writing his major works. And there's, if I don't get a haircut soon, this is quite an accurate depiction of me. But actually, it's an actor, Cavendish Morton, from 1909, playing the role of King Lear. O reason, not the need, our basest beggars are in the poorest things superfluous. Allow not nature more than nature needs, man's life as cheap as beasts. So this quote from King Lear is about the need for not excessive reason, the need for a part of humanity and a part of human life to be beyond reason. O reason, not the need. So the heart wants what the heart needs, or the heart wants what the heart wants, whatever the phrase is. You can't reason everything away. And then Bateson goes on to say, how is it that the art of one culture can have meaning or validity for critics raised in a different culture? My answer would be that if art is somehow expressive of something like grace or psychic integration, to the two of the things he's just spoken about, then the success of this expression might well be recognizable across cultural barriers. The physical grace of cats is profoundly different from the physical grace of horses. And yet a man who has the physical grace of neither can evaluate that of both. So this idea that art and its expression, or the way it allows us to get in touch with our sense of grace, Bateson suggesting is almost an innate human characteristic that crosses cultures. It's not necessarily culturally specific. So you can look at, I think in previous videos I've used Aboriginal art from Australia that is separated by as far away from the UK as could possibly be, and as ancient as any human art could be. And yet, for most people, it still speaks to modern people. Why is that? I think I've used cave paintings from Central and South America, where handprints speak to you across the eons. And is it the Altamira cave paintings of various animals that are still very poignant and beautiful, artistically beautiful, and some of the very first paintings humankind's ever produced. So Bateson's point is that they contain elements of grace that speak across cultures and across time. So this idea, I'm now going to talk briefly about Aristotle and Heidegger. Heidegger draws upon Aristotle's notion of the four causes. And I'm identifying this because it's to do with this notion of an ecology. That objects in art and objects in human culture have numerous interactive causality going on. And Heidegger argued, from a philosophical point of view, that modern technological culture has over-privileged one single cause, which he calls the causa efficiens, or in other words, efficiency. In Western culture, efficiency is our dominant value to the exclusion of other properties. And I think this links to Bateson's idea that conscious purpose is the thing that we overvalue in our society. So this is Heidegger. For centuries, philosophy has taught that there are four causes. The causa materialis, the material, the matter out of which, for example, a silver chalice is made. The causa formalis, the form, the shape into which the material enters. The causa finalis, the end, for example, the sacrificial rite in relation to which the chalice required is determined as to its form and matter. And then fourthly, the causa efficiens, which brings about the effect, that is, the finished actual chalice, in this instance, the silversmith. What technology is, when represented as a means, discloses itself when we trace instrumentality back to fourfold causality. So, very wordy, as I tend to say. So to put this in visual form, if you just look again at those four things, causa materialis, causa formalis, causa finalis, and causa efficiens, with reference to a chalice, the materialis aspect is it's made of silver. It comes in a particular form and design or shape so it can be held more efficiently, and it's designed for the human mouth. And then it has a purpose, so in a religious, I'm thinking of the Catholic Church, for example, at a Catholic Mass, ideally it would have quite a wide base, as you can see, so that the priest could hold it at the bottom and hold it up so it's visible to the congregation. So that would be its purpose, the causa finalis. And then you've got the silversmith, the causa efficiens, the person who actually makes it into what it is. And obviously, in terms of efficiency, if you think of modern technological society, we tend to have commodified, standardized objects because they're the most efficient to produce. So actually, we don't have many objects like this because this isn't mass-produced. You know, these are difficult. You need a skilled craftsperson to make something like this. Another example would be a table, for example, like a dining table. So the materiality is wood. The final cause, why do you need the table? Well, for dining. This time, not a silversmith, but a carpenter would make it. And then most tables have, because they're adapted to fit with human bodies, they have a particular type. The shape can vary, but it's, you know, most people recognize what a table is because tables look like tables to some extent. And the point being made in all this is that all of these four causes should be contributory factors to the objects in a human's world. And we are out of kilter because in our modern technological society, the efficient cause is what we place most value on. So I'm suggesting that this has parallels with we over-privilege conscious purpose, and we forget we have an unconscious side to us. We have a side of, in previous videos, I spoke about the importance of ritual. Often people don't pay enough attention to the material cause. So I just happen, bizarrely, I've always loved the material of wood. So in a different lifetime, I could have been a carpenter. I've always thought wood is an amazing substance. And guess what? In modern society, a disproportionate amount of the objects we use are plastic. They don't age with a patina. They don't age well. They're designed to be thrown away and replaced. And that brings with it massive convenience, and everything's a lot cheaper. But you'd have to, I was going to say, you'd have to have a heart of stone to talk about materiality, but I think you'd have to be quite dementedly obtuse not to recognise that wood tends to be more beautiful, more tactile, and has a whole range of properties that plastic never can. But just another way of thinking about this causa materialis, I quite like this. This is another Bateson comment. The lions in Trafalgar Square could have been eagles or bulldogs and still have carried the same or similar messages about empire and about the cultural premises of 19th century England. And yet, how different might their message have been had they been made of wood? So I just think it's a great example. Bateson's reinforcing this point about the contributory factor one of those four causes, one of those elements can make. And just to re-emphasize, I think in modern society we don't think in terms of the four causes. We tend to emphasize the causa efficiens. But just to back up Bateson's point with an image. You know, Bateson's pointing out that if they weren't metal, they would not have the same effect. The wood would age in a completely different way. So where all this leads to, Bateson talks about the four levels of the artistic mind. And that's why I mentioned the four causes in Aristotle and Heidegger, because I think they map on at least slightly to Bateson's idea of the four levels of the artistic mind. So what I'm suggesting is, just like you could argue we overemphasize the causa efficiens in modern society, likewise we downplay the true artistic mind has the four levels I'm going to talk about in a second. The artistic mind is very conscious of how those four levels all interact. And non-artistic life, most of modern technological life which isn't artistic, doesn't pay proper attention to the interrelated nature of human experience. So just to give specific examples. So the first level, this idea of unconscious habit. So Bateson quotes Samuel Butler, and he talks about how the better an organism knows something, the less conscious it becomes of its knowledge. And I've referred here to the depth psychology. So in Zen, I know very little about Zen Buddhism, but if some of you out there do, I hope I'm not getting anything wrong, but part of Zen Buddhism is to go into such depth that you no longer have to think consciously. And in a more Western, less Zen-like notion, Samuel Beckett wrote an essay, which I mentioned briefly in a previous video, about the way in which, in Proust's work, à la recherche de temps perdu, Proust often talks about habit, and a lot of his involuntary memories, the memories he doesn't call up himself that just come flooding into his head, they represent times in which your habit, your usual day-to-day existence, where you're not really reflecting, suddenly gets broken into, suddenly gets interrupted. So I think to some extent Proust is a brilliant example of the way in which the artistic mind is conscious of the relationship between the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. It's why I always go back to Proust and just witter on endlessly about him, because he's incredibly perceptive and sensitive to the relationship in human psychology between the conscious and the unconscious, rather than, like human resource departments, only valuing the conscious. And then there's an unconscious internalized mathematical perspective, which sounds a mouthful, but I refer to it as the train window phenomenon. So when you're looking out of a train window, you'll notice the scenery nearest to you, just outside the window, goes flying past really quickly at the same pace as the train. But things in the distance, very large objects, seem to be either stationary or moving very, very slowly. But ask yourself, why shouldn't you see everything outside the window going past at the same speed? And part of that is Bateson. I would maybe do it in a future video. I haven't got time here. But Bateson talks about psychological experiments that they can do that play with the fact your eyes make adjustments so that, for example, with the train window phenomenon, the distance doesn't move at the same pace as the foreground. Your eyes will subconsciously make these adjustments. And in various experiments, you can negate the adjustments your eyes make, and it creates what seems to you to be an optical illusion. Things suddenly look really strange because the experiment, the way they've done it, stops your eyes making the natural adjustments. So the point being, there's an unconscious way we see the world in terms of visual perspective that, by definition, it's unconscious. We don't know our eyes are doing it, but they do. And the example given here is a good one. A drawing of a chair with the perspective of Van Gogh affronts the conscious expectations and dimly reminds the consciousness of what had been unconsciously taken for granted. So to give you a great example, I only say great example not because I chose it, because it's by Van Gogh, and I just think it's stunning. But I think why Bateson's mentioned it is that the perspective there, that is not perfect perspective, and there's almost a sense that the objects, the candle and the books, are about to fall off the chair. And I'll give you more examples later of Van Gogh, but why I am semi-obsessed by him is that the way in which he seems in tune with his own unconscious. And he identifies elements of the objects he depicts in a way that isn't purely conscious. It's beyond the conscious. It relates to these elements that Bateson identifies as being part of the artistic unconscious. So back to these 4 levels of the artistic mind. Freudian dream theory. So metaphors are coded literally, primary process. We'll explain this. In Freudian dream theory, and you don't even have to think of Freud necessarily, but when you have dreams and you're trying to make sense of them with your conscious mind, I don't think it's particularly controversial or provocative to say dreams seem to have their own logic. And rather than, when you're conscious, there's an obvious distinction between what's literal and what's metaphorical. Whereas in a dream, metaphors, your mind seems to think in literal metaphors, if that makes sense. You tend to, whatever a metaphor, I don't know, your feet are so wet, they feel like, they're like miniature ducks or something, and then you might dream your feet have turned into ducks. That was a weird, dragging that out of my own subconscious, I think. But hopefully you get the idea that dreams have odd images that are often metaphors that are no longer, the distinction between reality and the metaphor is broken down, and the metaphors to some extent in a dream becomes literal. So ridiculous, bizarre things can happen as if they're perfectly normal, because when you're dreaming them, they don't strike you as odd, they strike you as natural occurrences. So that would be another element of this notion of primary process. Just refers to the pre-conscious, the unconscious. Before you consciously reflect upon something, we experience the world through primary processes. And arguably that is what unconscious dreaming is like. It's because we're not consciously controlling it, it's more primary than secondary. And I mentioned it earlier, the Freudian cellar, the every good repressed British man's method of dealing with the difficulties of life. Bring back the Freudian cellar. The unconscious is the place to which fearful and painful memories are repressed. That's what we need, more repression. So this idea of Freudian dream work, I like Bateson's counterintuitive take on this. He says classical Freudian theory assumed that dreams were a secondary product created by dream work. Material unacceptable to conscious thought was supposedly translated into the metaphoric idiom of primary process to avoid waking the dreamer. And this may be true of those items of information which are held in the unconscious by the process of repression. However, many other sorts of information are inaccessible to conscious inspection, including most of the premises of mammalian interaction. It would seem to me sensible to think of these items as existing primarily in the idiom of primary process, only with difficulty to be translated into rational terms. So one of the previous videos, the one with the two jackdaws on the front, the playfulness, the play of signals, in that I quote some of Bateson's ideas about how animals, what does it say here? Including most of the premises of mammalian interaction. So he's with the example of jackdaws and with the examples of dogs playing I gave in a previous video, it's not that there's instinctual reactions. The point is animals pick up on signals unconsciously and instinctively, and they don't need the signals necessarily to be spelt out in a particularly symbolic form. So dogs will pick up incredibly quickly on the fact that it's a playful nip rather than a vicious bite. And they seem to be able to do this. That they obviously don't spend ages self-consciously wondering whether another dog doesn't like them or not. A lot of their communication is referred to as meta-communication. It's instinctive and almost beyond explicit signalling. So it's only with difficulty to be translated into rational terms. And again, with respect to artists, arguably this is what great artists do. While it's incredibly difficult to translate this type of stuff into rational terms, artists, to the extent it's possible, do manage to translate it. So this notion of the repressed conscious. In other words, I believe that much of early Freudian theory was upside down. At that time, many thinkers regarded conscious reason as normal and self-explanatory, while the unconscious was regarded as mysterious, needing proof and needing explanation. Repression was the explanation, and the unconscious was filled with thoughts which could have been conscious, but which repression and dream work had distorted. Today, we think of consciousness as the mysterious, and of the computational methods of the unconscious, for example, primary process, as continually active, necessary, and all-embracing. So Bateson's making a very counterintuitive point. He's suggesting, and this has been picked up in cognitive linguistics I mentioned earlier, that cognitive scientists, neuroscientists are increasingly realizing the real mystery to explain is not the unconscious, it's our conscious thoughts. And in future weeks, I hope to give you more and more examples of how the previously mysterious unconscious actually, when you analyze it, has some linguistic patterns that make it more accessible and more easily understood. And even if not easily understood, there's strong evidence to suggest that we unconsciously process lots of elements of our existence before the rational mind ever gets near that material. And it's just, I'm really, really interested in the way in which you can analyze language, hence cognitive linguistics. You can analyze language to see the role in which language structures thought, rather than traditionally in Western philosophy, the notion has always been the mind determines how language is used. And I'm not saying it's the only answer, but there's strong evidence to suggest that language very much affects how we think in ways that weren't previously suspected. And just to give you, I'm going to give you a very quick overview, just a little hint of what I might look at in future weeks regarding conceptual linguistics, and specifically the notion of what's called conceptual blending. So conceptual blending is this idea that at an unconscious level the brain performs various operations blended together. So if you think of here, if you're not spatially minded, I tend to be much more word-based, as you've probably cottoned on. But I often think diagrams help people who aren't as wordy. But if you think of generic space as basically like space as a container, so a painting that's done in three-dimensional perspective is a way of portraying generic space. And then within generic space, when it says input space 2 and input space 1, let's say input space 1 was a tree that you started paying particular attention to. And then input space 2 was a house, something different. The idea is that things like metaphors inhabit this space across the middle, the cross-space mapping. So there might be the similarity, the tree might have elements of the tree might look like the roof of the house. So then you visually and conceptually start to compare the two. And these take place with, as you can see, in the mind, this all takes place through the concept of blended space. The generic space that your brain first encounters then gets blended with these selective projections, how we experience the inputs coming into our heads. And part of that processing of inputs is through this cross-space mapping, this idea of things like metaphors. So just to recap, generic space captures a common structure which is present in all input spaces. So for argument's sake, three-dimensional space. Input space provides the contents of a specific situation or idea. Blended space contains a general structure from a generic space, as well as some elements from input spaces chosen and mapped onto this space through selective projection. Cross-space mapping of counterparts represents various types of connections, such as metaphoric connections between matching structures in the input spaces. So like I say, I'll go into this in more depth, but I just want to look at, specific aspects of cognitive linguistics. But what the take-home message from this is, these are the type of things, these are the processes cognitively that the conscious mind doesn't have to be in complete control of. So most of this diagram will have taken place unconsciously before the cross-space mapping, the metaphors and things the conscious metaphors begin to take place. And in future weeks, I'll explain how unconscious conceptual metaphors actually structure the way we think. And I'm repeating myself, but this is a crucial idea. If it's true that at the root of our language, at the very root, at the very basis, as we use it, at the most basic level, metaphors are important, because art, in its various forms, has a close relationship to metaphor. Art provides a bridge to the way our minds work unconsciously. And I think this is just a really interesting way of thinking. I've always, intuitively thought art is crucial, art is important. But increasingly cognitive science is finding ways through things like cognitive linguistics to suggest that art's relationship to the unconscious is much more structured than you might think, and therefore incredibly valuable. If, for example, you think, or I think there's an argument to be made, as I have in previous videos, that the schizoid autistic spectrum, the cause of lots of anxiety or feelings of alienation in modern contemporary society, it could be argued, and I think I'll try and go on to back up this claim, part of this increased alienation, part of this increase in mental illness is because we've lost touch. We've lost what Bateson referred to earlier as grace. We've become too self-conscious. We've put too much emphasis upon conscious purpose, and we do not have any more a natural bridge to our unconscious that, if we let it, art can provide. So this idea that, again, this is Bateson, poetry is not, just to develop the point I've just made, poetry is not a sort of distorted and decorated prose, but rather prose is poetry which has been stripped down and pinned to a Procrustean bed of logic. So this Procrustean bed of logic, the notion of the Procrustean is the giant Procrustes who was he? I think he was a giant. I might be getting confused. But he used to. I think he was he'd invite people. He was like a highway robber of people. He'd invite people in off the highway, and put them on his bed. And if they didn't fit, he'd chop their legs off or chop bits off. In mythology, this is so that they fitted the bed. And I think this is the Procrustean describes modern bureaucracies. So things like unconscious bias is used to cut people's arms and legs off, so psychologically, metaphorically, so that they fit the Procrustean bed of the bureaucracy and how you need to think. But to Actually, to go back, so that's the claim being made by Bateson. And it's quite counterintuitive. He's suggesting we tend to think that poetry is dressed up language of prose. And he's suggesting no, and this goes back to the idea that at the root of language lies metaphor. So prose is poetry which has been stripped down to a Procrustean bed of logic. So then we're clear with the terms we're using. He goes on to argue that allegory can be seen. He doesn't use the phrase, this is my phrase, manipulative analogy. But allegory can be manipulative. So he talks about an analogy. Sorry, this is just a basic definition of analogy. This isn't Bateson. An analogy is basically a comparison between two different things to demonstrate a point or to explain a concept. So a simile is something is like something else. A metaphor makes the claim that two different things are the same in order to explain something. So they're based upon analogy and ways of thinking like analogy. But an allegory is a story, poem, or picture that contains a hidden meaning or moral, political lesson. So if you can keep those two differences in mind, I think it's helpful for what Bateson says next. I was just really taken by this notion of Bateson's. Allegory at best, a distasteful sort of art. So why this interested me, if allegory is a distasteful sort of art, it gives you a sense of what's good about art and what non-art doesn't have. So allegory at best, a distasteful sort of art, is an inversion of the normal creative process. Typically, an abstract relation, for example, between truth and justice, is first conceived in rational terms. Excuse me. The relationship is then metaphoricized and dolled up to look like a product of primary process. The abstractions are personified and made to participate in a pseudo-myth, and so on. Much advertising art is allegorical in this sense, that the creative process is inverted. So I want to, this is quite wordy and difficult to understand. So I want to give you some quick examples, visual examples, of what allegory does in advertising and how manipulative it is. So metaphor is a basic comparison that tends to make you think and reflect, whereas when allegory is used in advertising, it tends to contain a hidden message, or the message that's being conveyed isn't being presented to you for you to think about, it's being presented to you to persuade you. I think there's a famous book called The Hidden Persuaders, referring to advertisers, and there's the brilliant TV series, if you haven't seen it, Mad Men, with Don Draper, the character, who was this Svengali of being able to persuade people using advertising as allegory, hidden messages, the persuasive force. So here's one example. Now, if you were going to deconstruct that, use semiotic analysis, I'd suggest my eyesight's failing, but I think it's a Rolex watch, or it's a very expensive watch. And part of the message of the advert would be, whoever's using this face scrub is a manly man. They can afford a bloody good watch. The watch obviously looks expensive, and the fact he's taken it into the shower means it's waterproof. So obviously it's a good watch. He's wearing it on the inside of his wrist because that's the way he rolls. He's radical. no one tells him how to wear a watch. So there's various. It's I'm thinking the way his thumb's on the top, it's almost like a grenade about to go off. But then there's the actual little dial and little description at the top. In just 2 minutes, this man's face is going to look terrific. And I'd suggest that, without you all shouting at me for being a pervert, I think that has a slight double entendre going on. And part of the allegorical nature of advertising is there's plausible deniability. So I'm sure the advertiser would say, Paul, you filthy, filthy-minded, over-interpreter. But I'd suggest that has an additional, plausibly deniable message. This idea of allegory has hidden messages. And then another example would be, this is a famous example from, there's a French semiotician called Roland Barthes, and he wrote a collection of essays called Mythologies. And I think it should be available online, but the chapters he uses, the various small chapters, use specific examples from 1950s France, and they're quite dated. But the first about half, 2/3 of the book is a long essay called Myth Today, which is one of the best explanations of semiotics, the study of signs, that I've read. So I'll try and dig it out and see whether I can put it in the description if there is an online copy. But this is one of the adverts he refers to. Now, if you look and ask yourself, what's that advertising? Again, I'm suggesting the way Bateson describes it, this like I said, Bateson doesn't use the phrase manipulative, but I think it is. He talks about the inversion of the creative process. But they're trying to flog Italian food. So they've got, first of all, linguistically, Panzani. It's a fake Italian name that's obviously Italian because it ends in a vowel. There's the colours of the Italian flag. And then what's hidden about it, and what I'd argue is manipulative. I can accept, all right, they've used the Italian flag. Excuse me. They've got the colours. They've got the fake name, so they're trying to express Italianicity. That's fine. But notice how the way in which it's a basket, a string basket, and the products are falling out almost like they're fresh fish just being caught. And there's all the little additions, so there's lots of fresh food underneath. Whereas what's being sold, every single element of what you can buy that's being sold is actually processed, non-fresh food. So it's dry pasta and tins and what looks like pre-grated Parmesan cheese. And to my dying day, I see it in supermarkets all the time, pre-grated cheese. How lazy do you have to be? And the minute you grate it, it loses freshness. And in order to at least retain some freshness, they have to put all loads of additives on it. Ugh. Anyway, I'm going to get angry. But do you see how that advert, it's using the freshness that's implied in the visual images to sell something that is the exact opposite of freshness. It's processed food. And I think that's what Bateson means when he talks about the inversion of the creative process. It's the complete inversion of the truthfulness of the situation, if nothing else. But anyway, to start wrapping up, in Freud's work, there's this basic distinction. Remember, in Freud, there's this tripartite, this three-way split: the id, the ego, and the superego. So this distinction between the id and the ego. So the id is the instinctive, the animalistic. The ego is the more conscious. This distinction I've been talking about. It is commonly assumed that it would be somehow better if what is unconscious were made conscious. Freud even is said to have said, "Where id was, there ego shall be," as though such an increase in conscious knowledge and control would both be possible and, of course, an improvement. This view is the product of an almost totally distorted epistemology and a totally distorted view of what sort of thing a man or any other organism is. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know things. So what Bateson here is suggesting is that Freud was typical of the Western tradition. Where id was, there ego shall be. In other words, he wanted to have conscious purpose. He wanted to illuminate the darkness of the unconscious and shed rational light on it. And Bateson's argument against that is that, and I think this is what McGilchrist and others would back him up on, is that human organisms, like any other organism, it's this very complex ecology of the mind, this mix between the conscious and the unconscious. And to go back to the very beginning, this idea that unconscious bias is something that should be extirpated, got rid of, completely fails to understand how not just the human brain, but the brains of organisms work. So the way these brains do work is the notion of meta-messages. Messages that exist above the norm, that exist above what is most obvious and commonsensical. So in truth, our life is such that its unconscious components are continuously present in all their multiple forms. It follows that in our relationships, we continuously exchange messages about these unconscious materials. And it becomes important also to exchange meta-messages by which we tell each other what order and species of unconsciousness or consciousness attaches to our messages. So, again, quite wordy, but one way of summing this up would be in English, proper UK English, there's a phrase, he's a wrong 'un. And from whatever background you're from, I think it expresses the notion, you can tell instinctively, when you get someone gives off a bad aura, and you just know instinctively. They may not have said a word, they may not have done anything aggressive. Your instinct picks up that this is not a nice person, or they may mean you harm. And this notion of meta-messages and the unconscious, this is the type of the meta-messages, the messages we give off without realizing. Again, this is just another example of unconscious bias would fail to recognize the validity of meta-messages. So, in a merely pragmatic way, this is important because the orders of truth are different for different sorts of messages. Insofar as a message is conscious and voluntary, it could be deceitful. I can tell you that the cat is on the mat when in fact she is not there. I can tell you I love you when in fact I do not. But discourse about relationship is commonly accompanied by a mass of semi-voluntary, kinesic, which is non-verbal or gestural, and autonomic, which is involuntary or to do with the nervous system, signals which provide a more trustworthy comment on the verbal message. So this idea, Bateson's just emphasizing that non-verbal, kinesic messages, autonomic, involuntary messages, these can be incredibly powerful. So even if with daft things, it sounds daft, but pheromones, if you can actually, if you someone doesn't have to have BO, body odor, but you can, that's nasty because they haven't washed. They could have a smell that you don't like, and I'd suggest that is a pretty good indication that you're not going to get, you shouldn't be in a relationship with them. Well, you shouldn't get on with them. Whereas somebody else might find their natural body smell very attractive. And this is autonomic. This is, it's an involuntary response you're having just to a basic smell. Similarly with skill, the fact of skill indicates the presence of large unconscious components in the performance. So that's pointing towards, I think it goes back to the notion of autonomic, the involuntary. If you see a brilliant pianist, what makes them brilliant is that it looks so effortless. And partly it is effortless because they put so many practice hours in that are then like in this Zen-like trance where they can just play the piano exceptionally well. So it's not effortless in the sense that so few people can do it. But when they're that good and they've developed that skill, it effectively is almost unconscious. Which brings us back to the notion of the artistic unconscious. It thus becomes relevant to look at any work of art with the question, what components of this message, material, had what orders of unconsciousness or consciousness for the artist? And this question, I believe, the sensitive critic usually asks, though perhaps not consciously. So Bateson's just emphasising the extent to which great art or good artists are associated with the unconscious, as I've just described, the skill with which they perform, to the extent that it looks effortless, and to the extent to which they can almost unconsciously do it, is a fascinating aspect of art. So Bateson goes on to say, art becomes in this sense an exercise in communicating about the species of unconsciousness, or if you prefer it, a sort of play behaviour whose function is, amongst other things, to practice and make more perfect communication of this kind. So what, just concluding now, but what is interesting about this is, or what's a powerful part of Bateson's argument, is the direct link he's making between art and the unconscious. So art relies upon the unconscious biases of artists. It relies upon their ability to channel in, to dig into their unconscious impulses and develop them and to express them back to us. In one of the earlier quotations, remember, it talked about the difficulty of translating the unconscious. But that's what artists are able to do. And even if, and it's Isadora Duncan's phrase, if I knew what it all meant, I wouldn't have to bloody dance it, to paraphrase her. Because they have an intuitive sense of what they're trying to express, but it can't be expressed verbally, fully, or with gestures fully. The artist has to interpret it. But that interpretation provides at least the beginnings of a bridge to our unconscious. And just to vaguely amusing this picture, but Isadora Duncan saying, if I knew what it was, I wouldn't have to dance it. But here she is on the beach, as you are. Isadora's very expressive beach dance. And then, so I've very rarely referred to dance as an art form. So it's good to be able to show Isabella Dora. Sorry, why do I keep saying Isabella? Isadora Duncan. But to take it back to my favourite realm of literature, from Alice in Wonderland, the king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. "Consider your verdict," he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice. "No, no," said the Queen. "Sentence first, verdict afterward." Now that reminds me of when you fill in your unconscious bias online training form. Right at the beginning, before you're allowed to continue, you have to admit to being unconsciously biased. So you've been sentenced as a biased person, and the verdict comes after the sentence. "Stuff and nonsense," said Alice loudly. "The idea of having the sentence first." "Hold your tongue," said the Queen, turning purple. "I won't," said Alice. "Off with her head," the Queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. "Who cares for you?" said Alice. She had grown to her full size by this time. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At this, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off, and found herself lying on the bank with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees upon her face. I just think that Lewis Caroll is absolutely exceptional in portraying the dreamlike world, the irrationality of the unconscious, and the way in which earlier on I referred to the way in which metaphors become literal in dreams. And Lewis Caroll, ahead of his time, is describing the irrationality of bureaucratic unconscious bias training. Sentence first, verdict afterward. But also, just on a broader note, the way in which the dream of Alice ends with how it was in reality, her unconscious was interpreting the gentle brushing away of her sister's hand. Lewis Carroll's able to express that relationship of the conscious and unconscious, and how that's cognitively processed in quite a brilliant way. So that's, I always go back to literature, but also in terms of visual art, just to finish. This is Arnold Bocklin, but it's got an umlaut. I always never remember how to pronounce the umlaut over the O. But it's spelt Bocklin. He was Swiss, and this is called The Isle of the Dead. And I think he did 6 or 7 of them, and was it 1880? I think he started doing them. So I think it was about 1880 to 1886, or thereabouts. But I would suggest there's a weird, dreamlike, unconscious atmosphere to that's quite disturbing. Or I love this. The shrouded figure on the boat, like going across the river Styx or Hades. The Isle of the Dead. Just incredibly evocative. And it's just a really odd-shaped island. And I don't know why. Are they poplars? But I've always found those trees just quite... I don't know, just the way he puts the whole thing together. It's quite disturbing. But again, it's the theme that's been throughout this talk. It's the way in which it chimes with the unconscious. There's a dream-like, trance-like state that he manages to portray. And then one of Van Gogh's last paintings. And again, I will always argue that Van Gogh, more than nearly any other artist, was able to convey the elements of the unconscious. And then I've done a short video very early on in the channel's history about the tree roots he painted, and I linked it to Jean-Paul Sartre's La Nausée, where the protagonist Roquetin looks at the roots of a chestnut tree. But I'd suggest this is one of the best examples I can think of about how an artist digs down into their unconscious bias. And without their ability to indulge their unconscious bias, you wouldn't have great art like this. And anyway, on that vaguely, I don't know whether that was an optimistic or a pessimistic note. Ambivalent, let's say. But I hope you enjoyed that. Until the next time, all the very best. Goodbye.